I'm sending you out 2 by 2, proclaiming as you go, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cast out demons.
I've been reading a lot of the writings of Dietrich von Hildebrand. Maybe not a household name, but one of the most important Catholic philosophers of the last century. Very influential on both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, von Hildebrand was, in the 1930s, identified by the Nazis themselves as their #1 enemy. Pretty high praise, that.
Outlines of the life of Dietrich von Hildebrand, but let me, in just a few minutes, which is almost impossible, in broad strokes, give you a portrait of the man. Now, Helmut Kohl, the great former chancellor of Germany, once said something about von Hildebrand that has always stayed with me as especially profound. He said that Dietrich von Hildebrand was a witness from a dark era in German history. And this gets at something in a way deeper than all the other things that one can say about von Hildebrand. And the reason is this: von Hildebrand saw the truth of Nazism precisely at a moment when no one else did. Today, we can comfortably and easily condemn it because it's become evident. But there was a moment, particularly the moment when von Hildebrand spoke, when the truth was somehow completely clouded. There was a moral fog. But then on top of it, it wasn't just the intellectual accomplishment, and here we get to witness. It was the fact that he gave testimony to this truth. He raised his voice and he stepped forward courageously into the public square. And I think that that's the great service of the moral witness, to stand for truth no matter the cost, and especially at moments when that truth is simply not seen by most people. Now, superficially, there's a way of reading the life of von Hildebrand where one doesn't see the enemy #1 of the Nazis coming. I mean, after all, he was the son of a nobleman and a great artist, Adolf von Hildebrand. Dietrich von Hildebrand was a philosopher and a professor, and he was a man of culture. But a deeper look, and this is what I want to leave you with by way of introduction, shows that he was in fact predestined to oppose the Nazis. So let me do this. There's just no way I can do justice to this. You just have to forgive me. I'll do this quickly. So, by way of biography, he was born in Florence of German parents in 1889. He was the son, as I mentioned, of the eminent sculptor Adolf von Hildebrand. Now, as a boy, young Dietrich, as a teenager, fell in love with philosophy through his reading of the dialogues of Plato. Now, what captivated him wasn't necessarily the element of argument and debate. It was the fact that in Plato, the question of truth had absolute primacy. And it wasn't truth in an academic sense. It was truth as a question to be lived. It was the question of truth that could give meaning and purpose to life. So von Hildebrand discovered his vocation through the reading of Plato, and then he went on to study with some of Germany's leading minds, and he became a star student of no less than philosophers like Edmund Husserl and Max Scheler. And he went on to become a major philosophical force in the years following the end of the First World War. The great Newman scholar Louis Bouillet said that Dietrich von Hildebrand was the most important Catholic philosopher between the 2 world wars. Now, something that I think all of you know here, but occasionally people don't know, is that Dietrich von Hildebrand was a convert to Christianity, to Catholicism. He'd been raised in a nominally Christian home, but the family was completely non-practicing, and the family religion was really the religion of art and of beauty. But this wasn't quite as superficial as it might sound. There was something very deep there. There was a spirit of reverence before all great things, and he inherited that reverence, and this turned out to be the gateway for faith. And it's interesting, he was drawn to Christianity, not by doctrine or history. He didn't read himself into the church like a John Henry Newman, for example. He was drawn by the beauty that he found in the Christian saints. There was something that captivated his heart and mesmerized him, and then brought him very rapidly into the Catholic Church. Now, the reason I want to emphasize this is not just to highlight Van Hildebrand, the man of faith, which is of course important, but because I myself made the mistake when I began thinking and reading Van Hildebrand about 10 years ago when I began the work of translating this book, to think of him primarily as a man of clarity and a man of courage. I saw the element of faith as important, but not as essential as it really is. But then I immersed myself in his memoirs, and I read the description of his conversion and the before and the after, and I realized that he is totally incomprehensible without his faith. And what became even more clear was that it was this lived faith that was unquestionably the source of his freedom of spirit, of his heightened sense for good and evil, which of course was his great contribution, and of his absolute trust in divine providence. And I'll share that with you briefly in just a moment. Now, in 1919, he was just 30 years old, and he took a position in Munich, at the University of Munich, teaching philosophy of religion. And from there, what is particularly significant is that being in Munich, he had a kind of front row seat for the rising Nazi movement. So the Nazi movement in 1919 was if anything, quite inchoate. The party hadn't even been formed, but he was there to see it unfold. In fact, all of his colleagues at the University of Munich were very infected by this German nationalism, which the Nazis were to exploit. I feel reasonably safe making this claim, though someone out there might contest it, but I think one can say that Dietrich von Hildebrand was quite possibly the first German Catholic of stature to grasp the essence of Nazism and to denounce it uncompromisingly. This goes back to 1921. I mean, in 1921, there was barely anything really to denounce. But the Nazis blacklisted him in 1921 for statements he made against nationalism and against anti-Semitism. In 1923, bear in mind that's 10 years before Hitler becomes chancellor, Van Hildebrand had to flee for his life when Hitler briefly seized power in this so-called beer hall putsch, which took all of about 24 or 48 hours, but in that moment he had to escape Bavaria, where he lived. What's quite dramatic is to see the aftermath of Hitler's appointment as chancellor in January of 1933. Van Hildebrand began to wrestle with the demands of conscience. He realized increasingly it would not be possible to speak openly against National Socialism without risking the concentration camp. And there were considerations of safety, but it's very important to emphasize it was always a matter of conscience. He could have quieted himself. He could have gone into the underground. He could have participated in this movement of the inner resistance, as it was called. So the question for him was, could he stay? And his answer was no. As a Christian and as a philosopher, he felt an obligation to speak out, to be a witness. And so in this respect, he had a very distinct calling from, say, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who we'll hear about tonight, who felt a calling to be active within Germany. So Van Hildebrand chose to risk everything to follow his conscience. And in March of 1933, he and his wife abandoned a magnificent home in Munich, a villa really, that they had inherited from his father. They abandoned their family and their friends and his circle of students, which was so important to him. And to what end? This is so important because the biographies give you the impression that he knew what he was doing. Well, he had no idea where he was going. He was going into the blackness of the unknown, but it was his faith that sustained him. And he says something so beautiful in his memoirs, and I'll quote this for you. He says, "I think I can honestly say that I would have left Germany even without any of the perils I confronted. But I had the conviction that my decision to leave was right before God, and thus, despite all of the uncertainty of my future livelihood, I felt myself completely secure in the love of God." And he quotes Abraham then, "Deus providebit," God will provide. And the months ahead were very trying for him. He went to the home of his birth in Florence, and he spent 6 months there discerning his future. He didn't know what he would do, but he knew he wanted to be of service in the cause against Nazism. And his sixth sense for Nazism put him in a very isolated position. His friends didn't grasp what was coming. They perceived him as overreacting, or they were absorbed in their ordinary daily affairs, and so they couldn't even enter into his worry. And so it was a terrible time of isolation. But in Florence, he began to take note of something very important taking place in Austria. And that was that there was a young Austrian chancellor by the name of Engelbert Dollfuss, who was the only European head of state at that time who had an openly anti-Nazi policy. And Van Hildebrand was struck by that and impressed by that. And so he attempted to meet with Dollfuss. It took several attempts, which was quite humbling for Van Hildebrand. And finally, he was able to meet him, and he presented to Dollfuss this idea. He said, "I want to be an intellectual officer in the battle against National Socialism." And he presented the idea of establishing an anti-Nazi, anti-communist, anti-racist newspaper, a weekly paper, And Dollfuss agreed. He was impressed, and he agreed to support this venture. So von Hildebrand moved to Vienna, and for the next almost 5 years, he launched what became the premier journal of ideas in the battle against National Socialism, and he lived in constant danger of assassination. You know, the Austrian Nazis were in communication with the Nazis in Berlin, and there were attempts on various people's lives, and von Hildebrand was frequently warned of plots against him, and yet he lived in complete peace and tranquility, which remains somehow unimaginable to me as a sort of nervous, I'm an Austrian. Austrians aren't supposed to be nervous, but nevertheless, it's quite extraordinary, the sense of the respect in which he felt that God was simply protecting him, and even if God would ask him to die or to lose his life in the process, there was somehow the feeling that it didn't matter because he was acting within the providence of God. So when I was preparing the book's epigraph, which contained 3 quotations, I wanted to do a kind of triptych of testimonies from people who captured the effectiveness of Hildebrand's witness. It's one thing to be principled, it's another thing to have an impact. And there were 2 that strike me quite especially. I'll read them to you quickly in conclusion. There's one that I'm sure you'll take some delight in, which is the exasperation of Franz von Papen, who was then the German ambassador to Austria, and he fumed actually to Hildebrand's brother-in-law, no less. He says, "That damned Hildebrand is the worst obstacle to National Socialism in Austria. No one does more harm." So, of course, a great feather in von Hildebrand's cap. But back to the theme of witness, and back to what Helmut Kohl said at the beginning, I think the most beautiful testimony to von Hildebrand's impact comes from his students. And there was a student by the name of Paul Stöcklein, a student of literature, in fact, who had this to say, and I'll leave you with this. He said, "Von Hildebrand immunized us and protected us from the philosophical waves that swept across Germany in those days. Heidegger's melodies," Heidegger being the great Nazi philosopher, "no longer had any power to seduce us, for our ears had become more discerning. Whoever understood von Hildebrand was saved. I think one can rightly say that history might have been quite different had there been more professors like him."
Germany. And I think we all have to understand that God speaks to us individually, that you cannot make, there's certain things that are rules for everyone, right? The Decalogue, a number of other things like that. But if God is a person and he wants to have a personal relationship with us, he speaks to us individually and he leads us individually. And he led, it seems to me clearly, Dietrich von Hildebrand to leave Germany, to be a different kind of witness, to fight from outside, but equally inspiring. His love of beauty, of truth, of art, I see parallels with Bonhoeffer as well, and I think that at a time when it's tempting in our secular culture for people to look at Christians as not so smart, not so sensitive, not so aesthetically inclined, to look at examples like von Hildebrand and Bonhoeffer, and to see that these were men of great learning and great artistic sensitivity. I think it's important for us to understand that that's part of truth and part of who God is, and God doesn't want us to throw that by the wayside. What Michael Novak was saying at the end of his talk, what makes Bonhoeffer and von Hildebrand so important, unfortunately, is that the battles they were fighting are battles that we are fighting now. That is tragic. It's horrific. It's horrific to me that we are beginning to see Christophobia, anti-Semitism, that we're seeing these things now, and they're taking some kind of shape that reminds us of what has gone before. It's never going to be exactly the same. Satan is not stupid, but God wants us to see. He wants us to have eyes to see. So to me, what makes von Hildebrand so special, and Bonhoeffer in a different way so special, is they really had eyes to see. They were not fooled. How is it that everyone else was fooled? So many were fooled. Not everyone else, but so many were fooled. Somehow they saw what others weren't seeing. And of course, it's a blessing and a curse to see what is there, what others aren't seeing. But I think that all of us, because of von Hildebrand, we're blessed to see what some others might not see. And we have von Hildebrand and Bonhoeffer to share with people today, to help them, if they're interested, to wake up to the parallels between what was happening then and happening now. Never saying that they're exactly the same, but they have the potential, unfortunately, to be equally grievous. And so I think that it's a gigantic blessing to have this book and to have you, John Henry, keeping the work of von Hildebrand alive, and more than alive, really, a renaissance, experiencing a renaissance. That's a great joy. The sad part is that I think it's because we need it right now. And I think it informs us where we are right now. So this is not about history. This is not about dead people. This is about truth and about God who is alive now. And it's a battle that every generation is called to, sometimes more pointedly and more clearly than others. And I do think that our generation is called to similar battles, and it's why I personally am so grateful for the work of the Hildebrand Project and for the publication of the book. So thank you.
Together like so beautifully, like this heart which is true and burns with the light of truth, like the heart of he who is the truth. But also it's a heart which like loves and burns with love, and it's a heart which is given and vulnerable. And I just think like there's like the answer, the remedy, the way, the truth, and the life is found in the Sacred Heart. And in the church, we always have this approach of both like confidence and security, but also compassion and zeal, and both truth and love. And all of this is found so beautifully in Jesus's most sacred heart. So much of the struggle and the tension that come about in the conflict in the culture in this month is different ways in which these are trying to be pulled apart and to be separated. And where love is being pitted against truth, and where truth is pitted against love, or where love is being exalted without truth, or, and this is something we have to pay attention to, where truth is being communicated without love. An initial proposal on just how to like what this means, and how do we keep these integrated, and how do we keep these one, and how do we, what God has made one, how do we not pull asunder? There's an encyclical by Pope Benedict XVI called Caritas in Veritate on truth and love. And it's real work to read it, like it's a real document, but he just so beautifully like reminds us of the unity between these two and the relationship between these two and the struggles we get in if they're divorced from one another. And so the first proposal is just, and it's free. You can find it online, Caritas in Veritate, right? Just Pope Benedict the 16th encyclical on love and truth. It's just really good. Basically, he talks about like love without truth. It's fickle, it's sentimental, like it's empty, and in the long run, it's even harmful.